At Harvard, the first door Anne ever touched closed on her face. The door was oak, heavy, centuries old, with brass handles worn smooth by the hands of generations. It guarded the main entrance to the Widener Library, that towering temple of books whose pale stone caught the late September light. For most new students, stepping through it was an unremarkable formality. For Anne, it was meant to be a quiet moment of triumph, proof that she had crossed the miles from the wind-scoured plains of Wyoming to the world's most storied university. Her hand was on the brass when a voice, cool and clipped, stopped her. "Not this way." She turned. A young man, tall and perfectly tailored in a navy blazer, stood at the top of the steps. His hair was the exact shade of polished walnut, his tie a silk Harvard crimson. His smile wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was the kind of smile that didn't care. "This door," he said, gesturing with his chin, "is for students, not milk delivery." It took her a second to understand what he meant. Then she remembered, the faint sweetness still clinging to her coat. Just an hour earlier, she had finished her dawn milk route, the last one she'd agreed to take before classes began, hauling metal crates into the kitchens of Cambridge brownstones to pay for the bus fare from the cheap boarding house where she'd slept since arriving. The smell of the dairy still lingered in the wool. She said nothing. In Wyoming, silence was armor. Words were for those who could afford to waste them. The boy, later she would learn his name, Charles Whitmore III, son of a Boston banking family, stepped aside, but not to make room for her. His hand rested lightly on the brass handle, an unspoken reminder of which side of the door he belonged to. "The side entrance is around there," he said, with the kind of precise politeness that was sharper than any insult. "Past the loading dock." Anne shifted her books from one arm to the other. The morning wind off the Charles River was brisk, and the coat's frayed lining did little to hold in warmth. She nodded once, a slow acknowledgement, and stepped away from the main steps, her boots clicking against the flagstones. She would not remember his exact words in years to come. But she would remember the weight of the door, the way its shadow fell across the threshold, and the vow that began forming in her mind before she had even turned the corner. "I will walk through that door, not by accident, not by permission, but because I belong here." The side entrance was a narrow steel frame, paint flaking, set between stacks of delivery crates. Inside, the library's scent, old paper, dust, and something faintly medicinal, wrapped around her like an unfamiliar coat. She found her assigned desk in the freshman reading room, opened the one notebook she owned, and began to write the date in careful, precise script. September 2nd, 1983. By evening, the air had cooled enough for her breath to ghost in the lamplight outside the freshman dorms. Anne clutched the envelope from the financial aid office like a lifeline. Her father had sent her here with $18 cash, and a letter folded so many times the creases had nearly worn through the paper. Everything else, tuition, housing, food, depended on this envelope. The letter inside was short. "Your application for aid is still pending. Please allow additional processing time." She read it twice, her pulse slowing, then quickening again. No aid meant no housing assignment. And no housing assignment meant nowhere to sleep. The dormitories loomed across the yard, windows glowing with the warm light of settled lives. Through one, she caught a glimpse of a room stacked with books, a poster of Einstein, a pair of clean sneakers lined neatly by the door. Somewhere inside, other freshmen were already planning weekend trips, setting up stereos, laughing over dining hall trays. She walked until she found the basement of the old brick dormitory. The laundry room smelled of starch and warm metal. The hum of the machines filled the silence. She set her backpack, all she had brought from Wyoming, against the wall, curled up on the linoleum beneath the dryer vents, and let the steady vibration of the tumblers become a lullaby. Somewhere above her, muffled through the pipes, a stereo played Billy Joel's Piano Man. She closed her eyes and for a moment imagined that the rumble of the dryers was the sound of the wind sweeping across her father's pasture. It had not always been this way. The quiet, the survival calculations running like background static in her mind. But ever since the accident, time had split into before and after. Before, her father tossing hay bales into the back of the pickup, her mother laughing from the porch, the kitchen smelling of cinnamon rolls and coffee. After, the day her father's back broke under a falling beam in the barn, the winter her mother's breath turned shallow and stopped before dawn. By 17, Anne had been running the household and finishing high school in a town where most girls her age were already planning to marry into neighboring ranches. A teacher had slipped her a worn copy of the prime number theorem, saying simply, "You might like this." She had devoured it in 2 nights, unable to stop tracing the strange, invisible music that lay beneath the march of numbers. From there, she had stumbled into the vast and unsolved riddle that mathematicians called the Riemann hypothesis. Even now, standing in Harvard Yard, she could recite its heart in plain language. If the zeros of the Riemann zeta function all lie on the critical line Ries il 1/2, then the distribution of prime numbers is as regular as it can possibly be in this universe. Elegant, terrifying, and worth $1 million in prize money. Not that she cared about the money. It wasn't about the prize. It was about the music behind the veil. That night, in the laundry room, she took her father's folded letter from her coat pocket. "Don't let them tell you you can't." The words were crooked, penned in his slow, stiff handwriting, each letter shaped as though cut from wood. She slept under those words, the thrum of the dryers and the hum of fluorescent lights her only companions. The next morning, as the early light slanted through the yard, Anne slipped into the dining hall. She had exactly $2.15 left, enough for black coffee and a bagel. The coffee was bitter, the bagel tough, but the heat in her hands was worth the coins. At a table across the room, Charles Whitmore III laughed with 2 friends over a copy of The Crimson. He didn't glance her way. She didn't mind. She wasn't here for him. She was here for the equations in the margins of her notebook, the ones she worked on between shifts at the library's circulation desk. She was here for the stacks of books that smelled of dust and possibility. She was here for the dream she'd carried from a kitchen table in Wyoming to this ancient yard of red brick and stone. And one day, though not yet, she would be here for the door. The Wyoming wind never simply blew. It prowled. It scraped. It curled its fingers through the rusted barbed wire along the pasture fences and sang in a key only the plains understood. Even in Cambridge, months and miles away, Anne could summon that sound, a low, unbroken hum, as if the earth itself were reminding you of your smallness. She felt it again now, as she sat in the dim lecture hall of Mathematics 251 Advanced Analysis, her pencil poised above an empty sheet. Outside, Boston's autumn leaves fluttered in a polite breeze. But in her memory, the Wyoming wind pressed its cold palm to her cheek. It had been the soundtrack of her childhood, the nights she worked by a bare bulb in the barn, her desk, nothing more than an old plank balanced on 2 milk crates. There, between refilling the water troughs and mending harness straps, she'd traced the strange, shimmering landscape of numbers, prime numbers to be exact. The indivisible sentinels that stood guard along the infinite road of integers. Her father had once caught her scribbling a proof instead of fixing the hinge on the chicken coop. "Does it pay in eggs?" he asked, not unkindly. She'd smiled. No. Then why bother? Because, she said, if I understand it, I'll know something no one can take from me. He had looked at her for a long time, then handed her the wrench. Fix the hinge first, then chase your ghosts. Here in Harvard's lecture hall, Professor Bennett's voice cut through her reverie. Let us warm up with something. Challenging. He turned to the blackboard, chalk squealing slightly as he wrote out a partial differential equation with mixed boundary conditions. The murmurs in the room confirmed what Anne already knew. Nasty enough to tangle even the best-prepared mind on a Tuesday morning. Bennett turned, scanning the rows. His gaze paused, not with malice, but with the faint curiosity of a man checking whether the rumors were true. Miss Morgan, care to have a try? A half-dozen heads swiveled. Anne pushed back her chair, the wooden legs scraping softly. She approached the board. Most would attempt separation of variables immediately, but she saw something different. The symmetry hinted at a transform solution. With careful strokes, she worked through the steps. The solution fell out cleanly, like a coin from a well-worn pocket. Then she stepped back, chalk dust faint on her coat sleeve. Silence. Then Bennett gave a single nod. Approval, though no smile. Somewhere in the back, Charles Whitmore's voice drifted. Beginner's luck. It wasn't luck. It was the same instinct that had drawn her to the Riemann hypothesis back in Wyoming. The problem wasn't just a problem, it was a mountain. And she had always wanted to know what the world looked like from the summit. She had first heard of Bernhard Riemann in a dusty library in Cheyenne, in a book whose cover had long ago lost its color. The hypothesis itself. The claim that every non-trivial zero of the zeta function lies on a single line in the complex plane. Read like poetry she wasn't yet old enough to understand. But she knew, with a clarity rare in a girl of 17, that this was her calling. That night in the Cheyenne library, the wind had been howling against the windows, the kind that made the panes tremble. She had traced the definition of the zeta function with her finger and whispered to herself, "Where do you hide?" After class, Anne gathered her books. Charles leaned against the doorframe, blocking her path. His friends flanked him like polite shadows. "Word around the yard," he began, "is you think you're going to survive here." His tone was light, conversational, the way one might comment on the weather. Care to make it interesting? She looked at him evenly. No. That's too bad. I was going to wager you'd be gone before Christmas. But I suppose it's hardly a bet if you're not here to hear it. His friends chuckled softly. She stepped past him without a word. In Wyoming, the wind never stopped to argue with the fence posts. That night, she spread her notes across a table in the library's basement. Around her, the air smelled of leather bindings and time. In the margin of her Riemann notes, she wrote, "Wind carves rock by persistence, not force." Her father's phrase, slightly altered but true. A lamp flickered, the light catching on the thin scar across her knuckles, a souvenir from repairing a tractor pump in January. The scar had faded to silver now, but it reminded her that precision and patience were born in the same hands. Somewhere upstairs, a clock chimed 9. Outside, the wind of Cambridge, soft, almost apologetic, stirred the leaves along the library steps. But in her mind, it was the Wyoming wind again, carrying the smell of sagebrush and cold iron and the steady, unbroken promise of the horizon. By the end of the week, word of Charles's bet had drifted through the freshman class. It didn't sting, not exactly, but it clung, the way milk scent clung to her coat. People noticed her now, but only to see whether she looked close to quitting. She noticed something too. Every problem Bennett set before them was a door, Some were locked, some ajar. Each one reminded her of the oak doors of Widener and of the vow she carried in the quietest part of herself. She would open them all, one by one. Anne's hands smelled faintly of paper and dust by the end of her shift. The Widener Library at night was another country entirely. The marble steps outside cooling in the autumn air, the great doors locked to all but the few with late access. Inside, the stacks stood like sleeping sentinels, each row a narrow canyon of knowledge. The air was heavy with the scent of leather, old glue, and the quiet patience of centuries. Her job at the circulation desk was simple: stamp the due dates, file the returns, wheel the carts of books back into their high, dim shelves. The pay was modest, but it bought her bread, coffee, and the quiet hours when the rest of the world forgot she existed. It was during one of these nights that she first met Thomas, the night guard. He was a tall man with a stoop in his shoulders and a walk that seemed measured to the rhythm of the library's echo. His hair was the color of old steel wool, his voice gravel wrapped in warmth. "You must be the new girl," he said that first week, leaning on the desk as the clock in the hall struck 9. "Farm girl, right?" Anne's eyes narrowed slightly. "Wyoming." "Close enough," he said with a faint smile. "Wait here." He disappeared into the staff room and returned with a chipped white mug, steam curling from its surface. The smell hit her first. Chocolate, rich and sweet. "I keep a stash," he said. "For winter nights. You look like you could use one." Anne hesitated. "I can't pay." "Not for sale," he said, sliding it across the counter. "Consider it rent for your company." She wrapped her fingers around the mug. The warmth sank into her bones. "Thank you," she said softly. By the second month, the cocoa had become a ritual. At 9 o'clock, Thomas would appear, sometimes with a story, often about his son who had studied here in the late 70s. "Bright boy," he would say, staring into the middle distance. "Loved math. Loved this place. We used to talk about how the books here could keep a man warm in winter." He would always pause here. He got sick his junior year. Never came back. Anne would listen, sipping the cocoa slowly, letting the silence between them do the work that words could not. It was on a Tuesday evening that she stumbled upon it. Not a book exactly, but a stack of handwritten pages bound with a ribbon, buried in the rare returns cart. The title was scrawled in looping ink, "On Certain Infinite Series." The name at the bottom was one she knew instantly: Srinivasa Ramanujan, the Indian mathematician whose short life had burned bright enough to change the shape of modern number theory. The pages were fragile, their edges browned, the ink faded to the color of dried leaves. Anne's eyes moved hungrily over the equations, but more than that, over the patterns. Ramanujan's work had always struck her not as a sequence of steps, but as music, strange and inevitable. Even without full context, she could see the rhythm in the margins, the leaps of intuition that skipped years of conventional proof. She bent closer, tracing one series with her fingertip as if she could catch the shape of his thought. "You're not supposed to have that out." The voice snapped her upright. It belonged to a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and the thin patience of someone who lived in the graduate carols. He looked down at the manuscript, then at her student ID on the desk. "Freshman," he said, the word dipped in distaste. "Where did you get this?" "It was on the returns cart," Anne said, keeping her voice even. "That's restricted material," he replied. "You're not authorized. And if you think you can use this to get ahead in your classes, I wasn't—" He cut her off with a sharp motion of his hand. "I'll be reporting this to the department. You should know better." Later that night, she found Thomas in the staff room, reading the paper. Graduate student named Peter said I might be in trouble, she told him. Thomas sighed, folding the paper with slow care. Some people think the rules are more important than the truth, he said. I've been here long enough to know better. Keep your head down, farm girl. You're not here to fight with them. You're here to outlast them. The next morning, an email arrived from the department secretary. Please report to the faculty review room, Thursday, 4 p.m. The words were spare, but the weight in her stomach was heavy. That Thursday, she sat in the lecture hall before her shift, trying to focus on Professor Bennett's discussion of measure theory. But her mind kept sliding back to the stack of Ramanujan pages and the look in Peter's eyes, that thin, sharp certainty that she was out of place here. When class ended, she slid her notebook into her bag. Charles was leaning in the doorway again, the way a man might lean against a tree in no hurry at all. Trouble already? He asked, his tone bright with false sympathy. I hear the graduate students are rather territorial. Anne stepped past him without looking up. She had learned that wind lost its strength if you didn't stand in its path. That night the library felt different, not less beautiful, but heavier, as if the shelves themselves were waiting to see what she would do. Thomas brought the cocoa as usual, setting it down without a word. She drank it slowly, letting the warmth anchor her. Whatever happened before the faculty panel, she knew this much. No one could take away the fact that for one night, she had held in her hands the pages of a mind that saw the universe in numbers. And that, she thought, was worth any door, wrong or right. The faculty review room was nothing like the classrooms Anne knew. The walls were paneled in dark oak, the kind that drank the light from the tall windows. 3 portraits of former department heads stared down from gilt frames, their eyes painted with the same permanent skepticism. A long table stood at the center, its surface polished to the point that it reflected the brass desk lamps like small pools of sunlight. Anne stood just inside the door, her hands loosely clasped behind her back. She could feel the faint tremor in her fingertips, but her face was calm. Years in Wyoming had taught her that fear was best hidden in stillness. The door closed softly behind her. At the far end of the table sat 3 professors. The one in the middle, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, cleared her throat. "Miss Morgan," she said, "please take a seat." Anne sat. The chair was too soft, the leather sighing under her weight. "You are here," the woman continued, "because of a concern raised by a graduate student regarding your handling of certain rare archival materials. Specifically, handwritten notes attributed to Srinivasa Ramanujan. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" "Yes, ma'am," Anne said quietly. The manuscript was on the returns cart in the rare section. I examined it briefly before returning it to the secure shelf. One of the other professors, a narrow man with a pinched expression, leaned forward. "You admit to examining restricted material without clearance?" "I didn't know it was restricted," Anne said. "There was no label, and it had been placed with general returns." "That is no excuse," the man said. His tone was clipped, his words like the ticking of a clock. Anne let the silence settle. She had learned long ago that filling silence could be a mistake. Then Professor Bennett spoke. He had been sitting slightly apart, arms crossed, his gaze steady on her. "I know the student who raised this," he said, his voice low but cutting through the room. "And I know Miss Morgan's work. She doesn't need to steal ideas. She is, in fact, ahead of most of the second-year cohort in her reasoning. This," he gestured faintly, "is a misunderstanding. One that would be avoided if certain graduate students understood the difference between curiosity and misconduct." The silver-haired woman looked from Bennett to Anne. "Is that so?" Bennett's jaw tightened. "Yes." A pause followed, long enough for Anne to hear the faint creak of the wood as someone shifted in their chair. Finally, the woman nodded. "Very well. Miss Morgan, you are reminded to exercise caution. This matter is closed." Anne stood. "Thank you." Outside, the hallway felt brighter, though the sun had already shifted toward late afternoon. Students moved past in pairs, their conversations spilling and fading. She had barely taken 3 steps before she heard the familiar voice. "Well," Charles Whitmore said, leaning against the wall with a folded newspaper in his hands, "looks like you survived another one." She didn't break stride. "You know," he went on, falling into step beside her, "this place has a way of teaching people where they belong. You can fight it, or you can accept it. I wonder which you'll choose." Anne turned her head slightly. "Neither." "Neither?" His tone carried amusement. "I'll build my own place," she said, and walked on. That evening, she returned to the circulation desk for her shift. Thomas raised an eyebrow when she walked in. "Still standing," he said. "Still here," she replied. As she sorted the returns, she noticed a thin envelope with her name written in careful penmanship. She opened it. Inside was a printed notice from the financial aid office. Reminder: students exceeding the maximum allowed work hours may be subject to review and potential loss of scholarship. Her stomach tightened. She had taken extra hours at the library to cover the cost of books and food. She had counted every shift carefully, but it seemed she had miscalculated. One mistake, one signature on the wrong line, and she could lose everything. When she left the library that night, the air outside was crisp. The lamps along the yard glowed in soft halos. She paused at the edge of the steps, looking toward the main doors of Widener. They were closed now, their weight and history pressing against the dark. Anne drew in the cold air and let it out slowly. Trouble came in many forms: whispers from students, panels of professors, letters from offices with rules no one explained. But so did resolve. And in her experience, resolve was like the Wyoming wind. It could wear down even the tallest stone if it blew long enough. She pulled her coat tighter and started toward the dorms, her boots tapping steadily against the path. The first snow of December had turned Harvard Yard into a postcard. The elm trees stood bare, their branches tracing dark patterns against the pale sky, while the brick paths cut clean lines through the white. Students hurried past in coats and scarves, their arms loaded with wrapped gifts, their laughter trailing into the cold air like ribbons. Anne stood just outside the dormitory, hands deep in the pockets of her worn coat. In the week leading up to Christmas, she had watched the exodus begin. Suitcases rattling over cobblestones, parents embracing children, taxi doors slamming shut. Every evening, another set of windows went dark as rooms emptied for the holidays. She had no ticket home. Home was 2,000 miles away, and the price of the bus to Wyoming might as well have been a flight to the moon. Her father had written to say he understood. "Take care of yourself first," he had scrawled. "We'll see each other when the thaw comes." The words were kind, but they felt like a thin blanket against a long winter night. On Christmas Eve, she walked to the library. It was closed, of course, but the steps were familiar, the stone worn smooth by years of use. She sat there for a while, watching the snow fall through the beam of a nearby street lamp. Each flake spun in its own slow dance before settling on the marble rail. "Thought I'd find you here." Thomas's voice came from the shadows. He wore his heavy wool coat, the same one she had seen him in every night since October. In his gloved hands was a thermos and 2 enamel mugs. "Hot cocoa?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He poured without a word, the steam curling up into the cold. They sat together in silence for a time, sipping from the mugs. "Place is too quiet tonight," Thomas said at last. "I used to hate that. My son, though, He liked it. Said the quiet let the books speak louder. Anne looked at him. You've told me about him before. Not the ending, Thomas said. His breath made small clouds in the air. Leukemia. Came fast. He was 21. One day we were talking about a proof he was working on, and the next, there wasn't time for anything. The snow seemed to muffle the world around them. I'm sorry, she said softly. Thomas nodded once, as if the words were enough. You remind me of him. Same way you hold a pencil, like it's a compass. Same way you forget to eat when you're working on something. Anne smiled faintly. That's not the worst thing to be remembered for. He gave a small laugh, then reached into his coat and pulled out a guitar. It was old, the varnish worn away in places, the wood scratched. Play something, he said, handing it over. I'm out of practice. So was he, Thomas said. Didn't stop him. She took the guitar, its weight familiar in her lap. Her father had taught her chords by the stove back home, the smell of coffee in the air, the Wyoming wind rattling the window panes. She began to play a slow tune, something between a hymn and a folk song, the kind of melody that felt like walking down a long, empty road. The notes filled the cold night, warm and fragile. Thomas closed his eyes, listening. Anne played through the first verse, then into the second. Halfway through, there was a sharp snap. One of the strings broke, curling back toward the neck. The sound cut through the air like a twig snapping in the snow. Anne stopped, her fingers resting on the frets. Thomas opened his eyes. Guess that's the song for tonight. They both laughed quietly, though there was something in Thomas's voice that didn't quite reach the laughter. She handed the guitar back. That night, she returned to her dorm room, or rather, the small corner of the laundry room she had claimed, and wrapped herself in the blanket she kept rolled at the foot of her bedroll. The broken string had left a faint indentation on her fingertip, a small reminder of the evening, but the stillness didn't last. The next morning, Christmas morning, she returned to the library steps, more out of habit than purpose. The snow was deeper now, the air sharper. As she approached, she noticed movement in the shadows by the side entrance. A figure bent low, the shape too familiar. Charles Whitmore straightened as she came closer. His coat was immaculate, his scarf a perfect knot at his throat. In his gloved hands, he held a slim folder. Up early, he said. Merry Christmas. Anne's eyes narrowed. What are you doing here? Just tying up loose ends before the break, Charles replied. He tapped the folder against his palm. Interesting thing about loose ends. Sometimes they're worth keeping. He brushed past her without waiting for an answer. Something in the look he gave her, a flicker of satisfaction, quickly hidden, stayed with her all the way back to the dorm. By the time she reported for her first shift after the holiday, the folder was gone from her mind. She was shelving books in the reference section when Bennett appeared at the end of the aisle. Miss Morgan, he said, his voice low enough not to carry. Do you have your notes for the midterm project? Yes, sir, she said. Why? Because, Bennett said, if you don't, you should know someone has already turned in work strikingly similar to yours. Same proofs, same structure, even the same marginal notes. Anne's stomach dropped. Find your notes, Bennett said, and keep them with you from now on. That night, she searched through her bag, her desk drawer, even the laundry room. The folder was gone. She could still picture the top sheet, the page where she had written out a key lemma, the words running at a slight diagonal because she had been writing on her lap. The image of Charles, standing by the side entrance, came back in full detail now, the way he had looked at her, the folder in his hand, But there was no proof, only suspicion. And suspicion was nothing in a place that valued evidence above all else. When she finally sat down on her bedroll, the sound of the broken guitar string returned to her, that sharp, sudden snap in the middle of a song. The music had stopped, but the night had gone on. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and stared at the small window above the dryers. Snowflakes drifted against the glass, catching the yellow glow of the yard lamps. It was Christmas. The year was ending. And she knew that before the next one began, she would have to find a way to keep the music going, broken string or not. Snow had turned the campus paths into narrow corridors of packed white. Students moved quickly between buildings, their breath hanging in the air. The midterm exams had arrived like an unannounced storm. Sudden, unavoidable, and merciless. Anne walked toward the lecture hall with her shoulders squared, her boots crunching against the ice. In her bag there were pencils, an eraser worn thin, and not a single page of her original notes. They were gone, as surely as if the snow had swallowed them. She had spent the week rewriting what she could remember, rebuilding from scraps in the margins of old homework, and from the outlines in her head. But it was like reconstructing a house from memory. The walls were there, but the exact grain of the wood was missing. The exam room was already half full when she arrived. Charles sat near the front, perfectly relaxed, twirling his pen between his fingers. He glanced at her once, his expression unreadable, then turned back to the paper in front of him as though she were a figure in the background. Professor Bennett entered with the quiet authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice to command attention. He placed a neat stack of exam papers on the desk and waited for the shuffle of coats and bags to still. "You have 3 hours," he said. "Begin." The first question was a straightforward proof. Anne wrote quickly, her pencil moving without pause. The second was more difficult, requiring a leap of reasoning between two unrelated theorems. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence of the room settle. In her mind, she could almost hear the Wyoming wind, steady and patient, reminding her to keep moving forward. By the third question, she stopped noticing the cold in her fingers. Her mind began to work in that quiet rhythm she trusted, each step leading naturally to the next, like walking a familiar path in the dark. Halfway through, she glanced up. Charles was watching her, his brow furrowed, a faint crease forming between his eyes. She looked away. When the final bell rang, Anne set down her pencil and read over her work one last time. The pages were full, the proofs tight and clean. She gathered her things, handed in the paper, and stepped out into the bright cold. Bennett was waiting just outside the hall. "Walk with me," he said. They crossed the yard in silence. The snow crunched underfoot, and the wind slid between the buildings. When they reached the steps of Widener Library, Bennett stopped. "I've taught here for 20 years, he said. "I've seen students break under less pressure than you've faced this term. You could have folded. You didn't." Anne didn't know what to say, so she stayed quiet. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the great brass handle of the main door. The hinges gave a deep, resonant groan as the door swung open. Warm air from the lobby spilled out into the cold. "This door," Bennett said, "is for you." She stepped inside, the marble floor gleaming beneath her boots. For a moment, she thought of the first day she had stood here, turned away with the smell of milk still clinging to her coat. She had walked around to the side entrance then. But not now. The warmth of the library wrapped around her like a blanket. She followed Bennett into the main reading room, the high ceilings and tall windows casting long bars of light across the tables. "You did well today," he said simply. Then he left her there, surrounded by the quiet rustle of pages. That evening, she found a letter waiting in her dorm mailbox. The paper was thin, the envelope creased from its long journey. Her father's handwriting marched across the front in uneven lines. She carried it to the laundry room, sat on her bedroll, and tore it open carefully. Anne, the bank, has sent notice. They say they'll take the farm if we can't pay by spring. I'm doing what I can, but the winter's been hard and the cattle feed is running low. Don't you worry about me. Just keep going there. If we lose the place, we lose it. But I won't have you coming home until you've finished what you started. The words blurred for a moment. She set the letter down, staring at the pipes above her head. The sound of water rushing through them was steady, unbroken, like the wind. She thought of the farm in winter, the barn roof dusted with snow, the wind chimes her mother had hung on the porch, their soft notes ringing even in the cold. She thought of her father, bent over the pump handle, his breath rising in white clouds. She folded the letter and slipped it into her coat pocket. She would keep it there until the paper softened at the edges, until she could feel the shape of the words without reading them. Somehow she would find a way to keep the farm standing. But for now, there was work to be done here. The bus from Boston to Wyoming took 2.5 days. By the second morning, the air smelled different, sharper, drier, with that faint mineral tang she remembered from childhood. The landscape outside the window changed too. The neat forests of the east gave way to wide, open land, the horizon drawn with a ruler, the sky stretching farther than seemed possible. When the bus pulled into the small town nearest the farm, the wind met her first. It was the same wind she had known all her life, restless, with a low whistle that threaded through the spaces between buildings. It carried with it dust from the unpaved roads and the faint, sweet smell of hay. Her father was waiting in the pickup, the old blue Ford that had been patched so many times it was more patch than truck. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face lined deeper by the winter. Still, when he saw her, his eyes lit in the way they always had. "You look colder than the wind," he said, opening the door for her. "It's not Harvard weather out here," she replied, climbing in. "Harvard weather," he said with a short laugh. "Out here, we just call it winter." The drive to the farm took them past snow-drifted pastures and barbed wire fences sagging under the weight of frost. The barn roof wore a thin white blanket, and the windmill at the far edge of the property turned slowly, complaining at every revolution. Inside the farmhouse, the heat from the wood stove wrapped around her. The air smelled of cedar logs and strong coffee. She set her bag by the door and went to look out the back window. The pasture beyond was quiet, except for the cattle clustered near the feeding trough. "How bad is it?" she asked. Her father joined her at the window. "Bad enough. Feed's running low, pump keeps freezing, and the bank's not in the mood for excuses." Anne studied the yard. She could see where the snow had melted in uneven patches, revealing bare, frozen earth. The water trough near the barn was crusted with ice, a jagged pattern across its surface. That night, she went out to the barn with a lantern. The pump stood in the corner, its handle wrapped in rags to keep it from freezing. She remembered working here as a girl, her hands small against the wood, the sound of water gushing into the bucket when the pump finally caught. She ran her fingers along the pipes, thinking about flow rates, about how water moved in a system. At Harvard, she had been studying optimization, how to design networks that carried resources efficiently with minimal waste. She began to picture the farm as a kind of network, the pump as the central node, the troughs as distribution points, the narrow, often blocked paths between them as weak links in the chain. If she could redesign the layout, shorten the distances, and insulate the key connections, maybe they could cut the time and cost of keeping the cattle watered. The next morning, she tested the idea. Using an old notebook from high school, she sketched the property, She marked the location of the pump, the barn, the troughs, and the windmill. Then she began to redraw the lines between them, moving the troughs closer to natural windbreaks, shortening the pipe runs, rerouting where possible to avoid the frost pockets. Her father watched from the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in his hands. "You're making a map?" he asked. "Something like that," she said. "If we treat the water lines like a delivery route, we can make them shorter and better protected. Less freezing means less wasted water and less walking with buckets." He raised an eyebrow. "You think moving a few troughs will save the farm?" "Not by itself," she admitted. "But it will buy time, and time's what we need." For 3 days, they worked side by side. The wind bit at their faces, and the snow squeaked under their boots. They dug shallow trenches for new pipe runs, set the troughs against the lee sides of the barn and hay sheds, and wrapped every joint with layers of insulation and burlap. The work was hard, but it carried the quiet satisfaction of building something meant to last. On the last afternoon, as the sun slid toward the horizon, Anne stepped back to look at the layout. The lines between pump and troughs were shorter now, cleaner. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Her father came to stand beside her. "You always did see things different," he said. "Your mother said you could find the straight road even when the rest of us were lost in the dust." Anne smiled faintly. "It's just math." "Maybe," he said, "but out here math has to hold up in the wind." 2 days later, a truck from a local church group pulled into the yard. A dozen volunteers climbed out, bundled in coats and scarves, ready to help with fence repairs and feed deliveries. Anne was in the barn, sorting tools, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and froze. Charles Whitmore stood in the doorway, his scarf pulled high against the cold. His usual polished ease was replaced with something quieter, almost uncertain. "Small world," he said. She stared at him. "What are you doing here?" "Community outreach," he said. "Part of a holiday program. My mother sits on the board." Anne went back to the tools. "There's fence line to the east that needs checking," she said. He hesitated, then nodded and left. That evening, as the volunteers packed up, Charles lingered near the truck. The wind had picked up, pulling at the edges of his coat. He glanced at the troughs, then at the pump, then at Anne. "You did this?" he asked. "Yes. It's efficient." His voice carried a note she hadn't heard before. Not admiration exactly, but recognition. She didn't answer. The wind filled the space between them, the same wind that had shaped the land and the people who lived here. When the truck pulled away, the farm was quiet again. Anne stood at the edge of the yard looking out at the pasture. The troughs stood in their new places, the pump's steady rhythm carrying water where it was needed. It was a small victory, but it was hers. The next morning, she would be on the bus back to Harvard. But tonight, under the vast Wyoming sky, she felt the same resolve that had carried her through the cold halls of Widener. Whether in the yard or on the plains, the work was the same, finding the right lines and holding them against the wind. Winter in Cambridge had hardened into its deepest form, the kind of cold that burned the lungs and turned every breath into steam. The semester had barely resumed when the announcement appeared on the department bulletin board: National Collegiate Intelligence Competition, regional teams now forming. Anne had walked past it at first, thinking it was for graduate students. But that evening, Professor Bennett stopped her as she was leaving the library. "You should apply," he said. "I thought it was for advanced candidates," she replied. "It is," he said. "And you're ready." The competition was not about memorizing formulas. It was about solving problems no one had seen before. Problems that mixed mathematics, engineering, and real-world constraints. The preliminary brief arrived in a thick envelope, a network of water and energy infrastructure for a fictional rural county. Limited resources, harsh climate, minimal budget. Anne stared at the diagrams, the dotted lines showing pipelines and power routes. The shape of the problem was familiar, uncomfortably so. It was Wyoming, in everything but name. The first round would be held in 2 weeks. Teams of 3 would present their designs before a panel of judges drawn from academia and industry. When the team assignments were posted, she scanned the list and felt the air go out of her. Team 4, Anne Morgan, Charles Whitmore, Peter Lang. Charles was leaning against the wall near the board, reading his own name. He glanced up at her with the faintest lift of an eyebrow. "Looks like we're partners." Peter Lang was the graduate student who had accused her of mishandling the Ramanujan notes. He looked equally displeased, though for different reasons. "This is going to be efficient," Peter said dryly. Anne kept her voice neutral. "We have a job to do." The first meeting was awkward. They gathered in a small seminar room, the radiator clanking in the corner. Anne spread the competition brief on the table. "It's essentially an optimization problem," she began. "We need to supply water and power to all points in the network with minimal loss and cost. Harsh winters mean we have to consider freezing risk. Sparse population means long distances between nodes." Charles leaned back in his chair. "You sound like you've done this before." "In a way," she said. "My father's farm has the same issues. Longer distances, fewer resources. If we map the infrastructure the way we mapped our trough system, we can cut waste and cost." Peter frowned. "We're not building a farm. This is a professional competition. We need something sophisticated." Anne met his gaze. Sophisticated doesn't mean overcomplicated. Efficiency wins. Over the next week, they worked in uneasy truce. Anne sketched layouts, Charles crunched budget numbers, and Peter modeled the energy load scenarios. Still, friction simmered. Charles argued for designs that looked impressive on paper, but ignored the limits of the budget. Peter dismissed any solution that didn't come from academic literature. One night, frustrated, Anne stayed in the library until closing. She took out her Wyoming sketches and began to adapt them. Shorter distribution lines, insulated key junctions, backup systems for critical nodes. By midnight, she had a design that balanced cost, resilience, and simplicity. The next morning, she presented it to the team. "This works," she said. "It's not flashy, but it's stable and within budget. Every vulnerable point has a backup. No single failure will collapse the network." Charles studied the map. "It's clean," he admitted. Peter tapped a pencil against the table. "We'd need to justify every choice mathematically. The judges will want more than intuition." "I can prove it," Anne said. "And I'll write it out so any of us can explain it." The day of the competition arrived with fresh snow. The auditorium was filled with teams, each seated behind a small name placard. Judges sat in a raised row at the front, their expressions carefully blank. When Team 4's turn came, Anne walked to the podium. Charles managed the slides, Peter handled the formal definitions, and Anne took the problem's core, showing how their design minimized cost while protecting against system failure. She explained how resource distribution could be reimagined as a series of connected loops rather than a single fragile line, so that if one section failed, another could take over instantly. Her voice was steady. The diagrams were clear. And though she never mentioned Wyoming, she could feel its wind at her back. The judges asked pointed questions. Anne answered without hesitation. When one asked why the design lacked unnecessary redundancy, she replied, "Every resource saved here is one that can be used where it's needed most. This system spends nothing on looking impressive. It spends everything on working. When they stepped down from the stage, Charles gave her a brief nod. You carried that. Peter said nothing, but for once his expression held no challenge. That afternoon, the results were posted on the big board in the lobby. Team 4 had taken first place in the regional round. They would go on to the Nationals in Washington, D.C. Anne read the result twice, then folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. For the first time since arriving at Harvard, she felt not just that she belonged, but that she had proved it in a language the university respected. The snow in Washington, D.C. fell differently than in Wyoming or Cambridge. It was softer here, drifting lazily through the air before settling on the broad steps of the competition hall. Anne stood at the base of those steps, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching the flakes melt against the dark wool. The national round was over. The presentations had been made, the questions answered, the judges thanked. Now there was nothing to do but wait for the announcement. Charles appeared beside her, his breath curling white in the air. He said nothing at first. They watched the snow together, the muffled sounds of the city carrying faintly through the cold. I suppose I owe you something, he said finally. Anne turned to look at him. For what? For the way I treated you, he said. Back in September, at the library door, in class, the bet. He gave a short, humorless laugh. All of it. You don't have to, she began. I do, he said, cutting her off. He looked straight ahead, his eyes following the path of a snowflake as it landed on the railing. When I was 16, my family lost everything. A farmer, a man we trusted, cheated my father in a deal. It destroyed us. I decided, without realizing it, that anyone who looked like they'd stepped out of a barn probably had mud on their hands. I saw you, and I didn't see you at all. Just the story I'd already written in my head. The wind tugged at his scarf. Anne thought of her father, his hands cracked from cold, his voice steady even when the farm was at risk. She thought of the cattle troughs, the pump, the long walks in the snow. Not everyone smells like milk for the same reason, she said quietly. He looked at her then, and she could see something shift in his expression. Not a sudden change, but the slow turning of a wheel that had been stuck for years. I know, he said. The announcement came an hour later. The hall was filled with competitors, the judges seated in a neat row on the stage. A tall man in a dark suit stepped to the podium and began to read the results. When he reached the top ranking, there was a small pause. First place, Harvard University, Team 4. Applause broke out around them. Peter's face lit with rare satisfaction. Charles gave a single sharp nod, and Anne felt something settle inside her. Not pride exactly, but a kind of quiet rightness, as if she had finally placed a stone where it belonged. The award came with a check, the sum printed in crisp black ink. Enough to make a difference. Enough, if she was careful, to buy time for the farm. That night, in her hotel room, she called her father. The connection crackled, the way it always did when the wind was high on the plains. We won, she told him. There was a pause. I knew you would, he said. What's the prize? She told him the amount. He whistled softly. That'll keep the bank off us for a bit. It's yours, she said. Anne, it's not up for debate, she said firmly. You keep the lights on. I'll keep working here. There was another pause, longer this time. Your mother would be proud, he said at last. Anne swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. I hope so. The next morning, snow still lay thick on the streets. Charles was waiting in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her without a word. What's this for? She asked. For the road, he said, and maybe for a truce. She took the coffee. "Truce," she said. They stepped out into the cold together. The city was quiet, wrapped in white. The snow under their boots made the same sound it did in Wyoming, a clean, crisp crunch, like the beginning of something new. Spring came slowly to Wyoming. Snow melted in uneven patches, leaving dark soil and small islands of grass that the wind bent low. The barn roof dripped steadily in the afternoons, and the cattle moved more easily now, no longer huddled tight against the cold. Anne stood in the middle of the old feed shed, looking at the rough wooden beams above her. The boards were weathered, the nails rusted, but the space was sound. With a little work, it could become something more. By summer, it had. The walls were patched, the windows cleaned and fitted with glass. The floor swept until the old pine planks showed their grain again. A chalkboard from a closed schoolhouse in town hung on one wall. Mismatched desks and chairs, donated by neighbors and hauled in the back of her father's truck, filled the room. She hung a small wooden sign above the door, "Wrong Door School." The name made the older folks smile when they asked about it. She told them the story in short form, how she had been turned away from the main door of Harvard's library on her first day, how she had promised herself she would walk through it again, not as a delivery girl, but as a student who belonged. "This is for the kids here," she said, "so they'll know every door can open if you keep trying." The first class met on a warm July morning. 10 children from nearby farms and ranches sat at the desks, pencils in hand. Some were shy, others restless. She began with numbers, not the way textbooks did, but the way she had learned to love them. She showed them how to see patterns in fence posts along a road, how to count cattle in groups to make the work faster, how the same logic that kept water flowing in winter could also solve puzzles on paper. In the afternoons, they read together, history, science, and sometimes just stories. The wind outside carried the smell of cut hay through the open windows, and the sunlight made warm stripes on the floor. One morning in late August, a familiar car rolled up the dirt road. It was newer than anything most folks drove out here, and when it stopped, Charles Whitmore stepped out. He wore jeans and a plain shirt, no trace of the polished Harvard boy who had once blocked her way. He carried a long case in one hand. "Thought I'd see the place for myself," he said, looking at the sign over the door. "Wrong Door School. Fitting." "It works," Anne said. He stepped inside, taking in the desks, the chalkboard, the maps on the wall. "You built this?" "With a lot of help," she said. He set the case on a desk and opened it. Inside was a guitar, new but simple. The wood pale and smooth. "Consider it a replacement," he said, "for the one that broke that night." Anne ran her fingers over the strings. "It's too much." "No," he said. "It's just right." That evening, after the children had gone home, Anne sat on the front step of the schoolhouse with the guitar on her lap. The sun was setting, painting the fields in gold. She began to play, the same slow tune she had played on Christmas Eve in Cambridge, the one cut short by a snapped string. The notes drifted out over the pasture, carried by the wind. Her father sat on the porch of the farmhouse, listening. Somewhere behind her she heard the faint crunch of boots on dirt and knew Charles was still standing by his car, not wanting to interrupt. She played until the last light faded and the first stars came out. When she finally stood, she looked back at the small building with its crooked sign, "Wrong Door School." It had started as a promise to herself, but now it belonged to the children who would pass through it. Some doors closed, some took years to open, and some you built yourself, one board and one nail at a time. Anne smiled, feeling the night air cool against her skin. "Not every wrong door is wrong," she said softly. "Not if your heart stays open. Thank you for staying with me." quietly, patiently, all the way to the end of this story. Perhaps somewhere in Anne's long road, you recognized a piece of your own, the days when you had to take the long way around, the doors you thought would never open. If this story has warmed your heart, even just a little, or reminded you that it's never too late to open a new door, then to me, that is the greatest reward. I wish you peace for the rest of your day, and I hope we meet again in the next story.